Hi, we continue in 2 Samuel 2 today after David has sent his messengers to Jabesh-gilead to give them a velvet glove and iron fist warning that they better join him and let him be king over them or else. Of course, he doesn't put it quite that way, but he does note that Saul, your Lord, is dead, and the house of Judah is anointed me king over them, and that's all he has to say. But meanwhile, Saul's commander, Abner, has other plans. So as we enter into our story today, there's great tension over what will happen to the remnant of the house of Saul now that Saul and Jonathan are dead. And what we're going to see is there's a surprising mixture of things we know and things that are just revealed to us about who Saul's sons are and what Saul's family is about. So we're going to have to take a little pause here to straighten out some of that. So before we do, as we've been doing, and if you haven't watched it, I really encourage you to watch the introductory video to this section, to 2 Samuel 2, 1-5, as you can see on the right side of the screen, covering some major issues that involve this section and its relationship with the rest of 2 Samuel. But for now, we see we're in this first section here, where David has been anointed king of Judah, and the question is how is he going to become king over Israel, which will happen at the very end of this unit. We've also been seeing how this unit is connected very closely with the unit about Absalom's rebellion in 2 Samuel 15-19, and today we begin to see some of that connection here around the question of the king's son's commander turning to support David and killed by Joab. We won't see that quite yet, but we'll see Abner here. But we are going to see the introduction of Ishbaal, or Ishbosheth, depending upon your translation and what source we're looking at here. Saul's surprisingly newly introduced son here, who will die before this unit is over. As we've been looking at the key words, we're really just looking at this one little paragraph here, and I was noting House of Judah is 3 times here, and it's really not anywhere else in 2 Samuel until we get all the way into the second half of the story, near the end of the story, more than the second half, the second part of the thing is unit that's parallel to our unit here. So the House of Judah is on David's side, and that's the question now presented to the people of Jabesh-gilead. Notice it's not being presented to them as if they are Israel. The notion that there are two entities, Judah and Israel, doesn't quite exist yet, and we'll see that specifically in our section today. Our unit 2:8-12 forms a nice, neat little chiasm, and you can see it all on the screen here. I'll put up the chiasm here so you can see that side by side with the text. So it's framed around Abner, son of Ner, and the naming of Ishbaal, son of Saul, and the place Mahanaim, which we'll get to in a minute. And then the B parts involve Ishmael being made king for 2 years, and David being made king in Hebron for 7.5 years, and in the center is the house of Judah followed David, leaving the pregnant question of whether others will follow David or whether they'll listen to Abner here. So what we need to look at here is these family reports of Saul, what we've seen earlier, and also about Abner, because if we don't remember, or if you're just watching this video apart from watching the videos for 1 Samuel, you might not know that as readers we already know something about Abner. So let's go back over these reports, starting with 1 Samuel 14, which gave us some important information that's inconsistent with what we see here. So we were told there that Saul had 3 sons, Jonathan, who we know is now dead, Ishvi, who we know nothing about, he's only mentioned there, and Malchishua, who's also mentioned in the Chronicles report and is said to have been killed in 1 Samuel 31. I put the Chronicles report here in italics because it's the only one on this chart that's not from the books of Samuel. But it offers an alternative. Instead of Ishvi, it has Ishbaal, not Ishbaal. So the New Revised Standard on my left side has Ishbaal, which curiously is not in any of the texts at all. I didn't go back to look at the originals, but you can see from my note on the left side, the Masoretic text Hebrew has Ishbosheth, which is to say man of shame, as my note has. Whereas Ishbaal, not Ishbaal, is in 1 Chronicles. The Septuagint has Jabesh-gilead, which they're just trying to guess out of that because in Greek that doesn't mean anything in particular. So we have some inconsistencies we need to look at. We're told in the beginning that Saul had 2 daughters, and that's not directly important to our scene now, so I'll come back to this later in chapter 6 when we look at the question of Michal. But it will be important later, so just to note the 2 daughters, Merab and Michal, each of whom was promised to David, but neither of them have children from David, as we'll see. So then we were told Abner, son of Ner, which is sort of obvious. Abner means Ner is my father. Ner, which is his name, but it also means lamp and is used in Exodus in a number of texts for lamps, like lamps in the temple or lamps in the tabernacle. So it could be light or lamp as my father, as well as the man named Ner as my father, who is Saul's uncle. But in the Chronicles report, we hear that Ner is Saul's grandfather, the father of Kish. Whereas what we hear here is the father of, Ner is the father of Abner, is the son of Abiel. So there's an inconsistency in whether Abner is Saul's uncle or whether he's his grandfather. But in either event, he's either a great-great-uncle or a great-grandfather of Ishbaal or Ishbosheth, depending upon how we pronounce that. So we saw in 1 Samuel 31 the fact that these three men were said to be killed and described as the sons of Saul, suggesting that those are all the sons of Saul. But we have here Abinadab, who's mentioned in Chronicles, and Chronicles certainly trying to make this all fit together. As, by all accounts, Chronicles is a later text than either 1st or 2nd Samuel. So Abinadab here from 1 Samuel, but not back in 1 Samuel 31, but not in 1 Samuel 14. That's the kind of thing, of course, that leads scholars to suggest multiple sources, and that may well be, but we won't be trying to track that down. In our immediate scene here, we have this, and I didn't highlight it there because that's our immediate scene. But then we have, going back, that Saul's daughter Merab was taken from David and given to Adriel the Maholathite, and that'll be important as we'll see below. And so then we find out later in 2 Samuel, just a couple chapters from where we are now, that Saul has a grandson, a son of Jonathan, named Mephibosheth, and we just find out who he is there, but it doesn't come up later. It comes up way later, but not in the immediate scene. Then we discover that Saul had a secondary wife, wrongly called a concubine in the New Revised Standard, but we'll look at that when we get there, named Rizpah, and that Michal, the daughter of Saul, had no child. So there are children from Rizpah that we see down here. Way later, though, way later in 2 Samuel 21, in what some scholars think of as the appendix to 2 Samuel, a scene happens where the Gibeonites are still upset at Saul and demand, before there can be loyal to David, that 7 of his sons be handed over us for them to impale before Yahweh at Gibeon. And the king, David, says he will hand them over. So there's no argument of whether they still have 7 sons. But the king spared Mephibosheth, the son of Saul's son Jonathan. And then we find out who these are. The 2 sons of Rizpah, daughter of Ai, whom she bore to Saul, are Moni and Mephibosheth. So notice there Mephibosheth is seen as via Rizpah, not via Jonathan's wife. And then 5 sons of Merab, daughter of Saul, whom she bore to Adriel, son of Barzillai, which is what we saw back up here, that she was given to Adriel here, although we weren't told that he was son of Barzillai. And it's these 7 who are taken and impaled. But even later, a little later in the same chapter, and I won't talk about the interim of how it happened, David went and took the bones of Saul and the bones of Jonathan, and the bones of all those who have impaled. Notice that are not named, and they're not named anywhere here. They buried the bones of Saul and his son Jonathan, but not all the others. So these are treated more specially. Something like the children of Abraham and are, as opposed, the children of Abraham with Sarah, rather, which is only Isaac, of course, versus the children of Abraham with Keturah in Genesis 25, where Isaac gets everything. And so here, plainly, the important son is Jonathan, at least from David's perspective. And so what do we make of all that as we enter into our passage here? We have Ishbaal, son of Saul, introduced out of nowhere. I'll just call him that because that's what the New Revised Standard calls him. That would mean man of Baal. Baal being one of the chief gods of the local Canaanites, but it also can simply mean Lord. So it could be a substitute for Yahweh, although Baal is not usually the Hebrew substitute for Yahweh. Adonai is. And so it's not exactly clear if this is just hinting at Baal was worshipped then and nobody thought much of it, that he was a man of Baal. And throughout the books of Samuel, we do not hear a prophetic critique of false worship. We won't hear that until after Solomon is dead, and we're told by the narrator that his foreign wives led him astray to worship the Baals and Astartes and others. And that's given as the reason for much of the kingdom being taken away from him. But that's a Deuteronomistic perspective that we don't see named out loud out here. So we can just call him Ishbaal without worrying about that too much. So with that in mind, let's enter into our passage. And we note that these things are certainly happening simultaneously, or this is a flashback. The language here, had taken, is certainly suggesting that this had already happened at the time that David had sent his messengers to Jabesh-gilead. And we have to wonder, although the text doesn't, we have to wonder about a couple of things, which is the state of mind of Abner and the state of mind of Ishbaal. We don't know where Ishbaal fits in the family order. Note that what you see on the right side of the screen, the narrator goes out of his way to note the order of the daughters, that Merab was firstborn and Mishal the younger, interestingly echoing the daughters of Lot in Genesis 19 described as firstborn and younger, with a bad outcome there, not the same outcome here. But we don't hear that about the sons. Can we assume that they're named in order of birth? Probably, but not 100% necessarily. If Ishvi is meant to be the same as Ishbaal, then we could say that he's second-born, but in the report from Chronicles, someone named Ishbaal is the fourth one listed, not the second one listed, so we simply don't know. We don't know if he's younger than Jonathan, but assuming he is younger and assuming he's not that much younger, what has been his experience? He's been silent throughout this whole situation, watching presumably his older brother Jonathan's relationship with David. And as we might see from verse 10, if Ishbaal, Saul's son, was 40 when he began to reign over Israel, and we are told here that David was king over Judah for 7 years and 6 months, but we find out in chapter 5, verse 4, that David was only 30 years old. In that case, Ishbaal is older than David, and that would make Jonathan substantially older than David, but we never hear how old Jonathan is. We only get this one hint of how old Ishbaal is. So we only could speculate about that. But certainly Ishbaal, if he's 40 years old now and David is only 30 when he reigned, has to have been alive and well aware of what was happening while the Jonathan-David stuff was happening, as well as while the Saul-David things were happening, while his father was paranoidly chasing David around the land and trying to threaten him with his spear. And what does that tell Ishbaal about his father? We know nothing about their relationship, and of course he's only being mentioned here after his father is dead. What does Ishbaal think of Abner, who uses Ishbaal simply as an object here? He takes him, as we hear, and brought him to Mahanaim. We don't hear anything about whether Ishbaal wants to be taken by Abner, how he feels about the prospect of being made king, or anything about that. He's just being manipulated by Abner here, and we never hear a word about Ishbaal's perspective here. Although we're told that he reigned for 2 years, so we don't know where those 2 years fit in relation to the scene right before us, if we're supposed to be at the end of the 2 years or in the middle of the 2 years, but it's not going to be long before Ishbaal is dead, which is just going to be a couple chapters from now. So what about Abner? It'd be important to recall this scene back from chapter 26 in 1 Samuel between David and Abner, so we might have some idea of how Abner's feeling now that David is king over the house of Judah and Saul is dead. So this is the second of the situations where David has found Saul either sleeping or not alert to David's presence, and we hear this. David called to the army and to Abner, son of Ner, saying, "Abner, will you not answer?" Then Abner replied, "Who are you that calls to the king?" And David said to Abner, "Are you not a man? Who is like you in Israel? Why then have you not kept watch over your lord the king? For one of the people came in to destroy your lord the king. This thing you have done is not good. As Yahweh lives, you deserve to die, because you have not kept watch over your lord, Yahweh's anointed. See now, where is the king's spear or the water jar that was at his head?" And after that, Saul speaks, and we don't hear a response from Abner. But certainly, if you're Abner and David has publicly shamed you in front of your own men, saying you're not a man, and accused him of not keeping watch over the one person he's responsible for keeping watch over, the Lord's anointed, Saul, then you would probably not be very happy that David is now in charge and Saul is dead. So in many ways, we can see Abner may be after the power himself, or he may be using Ishbaal as a shield, that he can hide behind Ishbaal and survive. But as we'll see, neither of them will survive. So with that in mind, let's enter into our story, and we'll put the keywords up so you can follow it on that side. So Abner, son of Ner, and notice how many times he's called son of Ner throughout here, as if we could forget. It's already imprinted in his name, but we hear that every time. Commander of Saul's army, and here it uses Sava, the word for war, a commander of war, in contrast with what I've been noting earlier, when the New RSV had army, but it was people. So now we have it officially, as we have around Abner, as someone over war in particular. If not an army itself, the word is termed referring to the fact of war rather than the body of people. So we still don't know much about how they're organized, and he's the only commander we know about. So he had taken what kings do, using lakach, the verb repeated 6 times in 1 Samuel 8. He will take your sons, and here it is, and brought him over to Mahanaim. And so that leads us to look at the atlas, not only for Mahanaim, but for what we can see in all these places. And as I was noting in the previous video, as Falkman notes, there are 49 different names in the first 11 verses, and here's a whole series of them. So he brought him over to Mahanaim here, and if I scroll down a little bit, you can see that where David was down in Hebron, which is down here. And so we're way up in the north here, and we can see he made him king over Gilead, which is here. The Asherites, and Asher, we really don't know, the term is only here, but it's put up here on the map. Over Jezreel, you can see here, and over the hill country of Ephraim, and Benjamin isn't on this map, but it's in this area referred to as Shual, and over all Israel, a generic term, which really did not have any specific reference in this time period, but as we know would be inclusive of everything else in this immediate area. And there's some things we have to wonder about that. What about all the people who live in these places? Could one man, taking him simply to this place of Mahanaim, let all these people know in this huge area that this man, son of a dead man whom they probably have no idea who is suddenly supposed to be understood as their king? It doesn't say anything about Abner sending any messengers, and so perhaps this is just in his head that this is happening, but there's no reason to think any of these people understand that suddenly this man they've never heard of has authority over them. He made him to be king, as we see here, using the verb that we've seen earlier, over these different places, and I won't go over those all in detail. But notice again, Benjamin is listed separately over Israel. Benjamin, which has mixed reports so far, is the original home of Saul, but also the source of David's 5th column of informers that we saw earlier, and they will be central to the quote-unquote play that happens in the very next scene, the very dark scene we see. And so then, coming around the chiasm here, as Falkman notes laconically, Ishbosheth, it's hard to say, isn't it? Ishbosheth has much territory but little time. David has little territory but a lot of time. And we're told he's 40 years old, and it's really a strange reference because there's no other sense of any of the ages of these people. How old was Saul? We don't know. How old was Samuel? We don't know. But this is yet another Genesis connection, the age that Isaac was when he married Rebekah, but also the age Esau was when he took Hittite wives. It's also, of course, a generic biblical phrase for a full period, like the 40 years in the wilderness, but not that many reigns are named as 40 years. So, and it says he reigned 2 years, but the house of Judah followed David, using the word ahari that we saw is used so many times, as you can see in my key words chart here, so many times in this chapter. And then the time that David was king is literally the number of the days, misper hayatim here, as in 1 Samuel 27, creating suspense as it does here. But what happens after the 7.5 years? We're told that he was king in Hebron over the house of Judah for 7.5 years, impregnantly implying that perhaps he's king over somebody else, somewhere else, for a longer period of time, which we'll find out at the end of this unit. So with Abner putting Ishbaal in place and the people of Jabesh-gilead, we don't hear a response from them. Abner will take another step to see if he can consolidate power, and we'll see that scene next time. See you then.